Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech hakol niv'varei. Chaim. Chaim v'bracha. Okay, we continue with our mimer. So based on the verse in Eicha, Lamentations, Chelki avayam nafshi, God is my portion, so declares my soul. And Medrash says, king came into the county with three different ministers, dukes, high positioned people. One said, I want this one did this one, and then one smart one said, I want the king. I want the king. Why do I want the king? Because the others are interchangeable with the king. He's not. Likewise, nations of the world, they serve the sun and the moon in idolatrous ways. Excuse me. Right. But the Jewish people, they choose God. Why? Chelki avayam nafshi, God is my portion, so declares my soul. So we ask questions. You don't have to be a smart person. You can be just even a child to know the virtue of the king over the ministers. You have to be smart for that. That's firstly. And secondly, the virtue of the king is not because he's not interchangeable while the others are. The virtue of the king is he's greater than the others. Not what in the future will be, but in the present. He's head and shoulders above the people and even his ministers. So why do we give the reason of that they're interchangeable? So we could perhaps explain as follows. As knows, how did idolatry begin? It began with an understanding that God is the creator and he's so beyond. He's like the CEO of a corporation, and the CEO of the corporation doesn't do toilets. So you get somebody, you hire somebody, right? And so likewise, God is um, that was my metaphor, the CEO. Give a different one. Right? God has those, if you will, intermediaries who work on his behalf, um, doing the lower stuff. But God ultimately is in charge, right? And that's not the truth, because the truth is that those entities, those celestial beings, would be the sun and the moon and whatever else, are only like an axe in the hands of the wood chopper. Right? That's a mistake to make. Therefore, idolaters make a mistake and they choose the idolatry because they feel that it is fitting to praise and give thanks to them. Why? The metaphor that's used is that when you're sitting at a table of the king and the butler comes over to give you a drink, give you some wine, well, aren't you going to say thank you to the butler? But whose wine is it? It's not his. What are you thanking him for? Because if you'll thank him and you'll be nice to him, he'll give you from the better bottle. he'll give you more, right? So this is the mistake that idolaters make, thinking that that these celestial beings have some kind of choice. And if they serve them, they will get more. They'll get more in life, right? But again, recognizing that, the butler is only a servant of the king. So likewise, in the metaphor that, believe in God, that, God has his servants on high, right? Who take care of things down here. Now, that's the original thought that idolaters had. From there, over generations, it devolved into worse, greater mistake that God actually left the world. There was a God, and he's irrelevant now. He's not in charge anymore. Now, the celestial beings, they're in charge. Similar to a king who appointed ministers to take care of matters of the kingdom, right? Even though ultimately their appointment is by the king, but nonetheless, they've been appointed and they are the servants. They are the ones who are going to make the choices now. And the king doesn't get involved. He doesn't mix into this small time business. Maybe at certain points where there's something big and necessary for the king to get involved, but in day-to-day business, he doesn't need to get involved. And the Rebbe says that this is what the term that's used for you know false belief is that they call out Al-Kada Lakaya, a god of gods, which is two types of meaning behind that. There are those that consider the God left the world. Not that there isn't a God, but he's busy with celestial and bigger things, and not the small, not what today's weather is going to be. To that you have to you have to pray to the weather station, the weather channel, or to your app, or to the weatherman. Weatherman, what do you got for us today? He's got nothing for you today. What do you got for it? Right? So there are those who consider the God left the world. In other words, he's not that there isn't a God, but he's just not engaged, right? Left it for celestial beings. And therefore, they refer to God as a God, right? He is Elokada Lakaya, a God of gods, right? So there is a God. In addition to this, that God is, in control ultimately. He is the ultimate, uh, power is with him, right? But that itself, that there's a power given to the celestial beings, that's in order, given to them by God, that they should be a, that they should be responsible and in charge to give influence into this world. And that's not coming on their own stead. It's coming from God, right? Coming from God. On the other hand, they are still called a God. So they're a God of gods. What does it mean, a God? It means that they have something to determine, just like as the butler can determine, you know, which bottle to give you or how much to give you, maybe might be better, right? So likewise, these celestial beings, they have some kind of dominion, some kind of power. That's why they're called a God of gods, but a God. Now, to negate all of that completely is through understanding that all of these intermediaries, all of these powers, they have no um, power of their own. Not only they don't have the power of their own, all they are is an axe in the hands of the wood chopper. They're their tools. They don't. An axe doesn't have a choice, right? So the sun, the moon, you know, the goddess of beauty, the goddess of of whatever it is. So based on this, we could say that the smartness of this one that they choose the king, as in the metaphor, that the Jewish people, they understand the truth, that all of the influence that comes into our lives and comes into this world is only like the axe in the hands of the woodchopper, right? In other words, when you look at the world superficially, you can very easily be drawn by that nature has got its own agenda. You know, it's got its own kind of path, its way, right? But when you think about more deeply, you understand that beneath the surface, no, it's God running everything. And not only is running it, it has no power of its own. It's not a God of gods. It's not a God that has some kind of power. Not like the butler who has some kind of, you know, determination to make and when he's pouring the wine, right? That's a faulty metaphor. So the Jewish people understand more deeply, right? And don't look only what it seems on the surface, that we know that really it's the axe in the hands of the woodchopper, that it's only a tool that God uses. However, that might be on the surface on how you would think that to explain this. Rebbe says, no, that's not a good explanation. After a whole page saying this, Rebbe says that's not a good explanation. Because in the metaphor, the analogy has to fit the analog, right? So what's in the metaphor? The king has ministers, right? So that means ministers do have a freedom of choice. right? They can make decisions independent of the king. Hmm. Which means that when you choose the minister, he could give you more, right? If you chose the agricultural minister and you're a farmer, and the agricultural minister can help you on your farm, right? And in the end, the agriculture minister does have some power. He can make some decisions. Well, in our case, in the end, the moon and the sun, they don't have any decision. They're just a tool in the hand of God, if you will, right? They have no choice. So we got to say a little differently. It's going to be nuanced a little differently. So it must be that there has to be benefit that the smart one, the Jewish people, are setting aside, putting aside in order to choose God. So there has to be some kind of benefit that you're right, that they're putting aside. So this, therefore, right, in the metaphor, that the reason why the nations of the world serve celestial beings and the Jewish people don't, they serve God, is not because of the making of the mistake that, right? Even though there was that mistake that people made, it's not incorrect what was said. It's just not the meaning of the medrash. That's the point over here. Medrash has a metaphor, so we have, right? Is it correct that there were at a time idolaters who thought that the sun and the moon had power? Yeah, absolutely. But that's not the metaphor. That's not the case of the Medrash. Is that a case in history? Yeah, absolutely. But not what the Medrash is talking about. So we're not talking history here. We're talking about Torah. We need to understand the Medrash. What is the Medrash saying when it gives this metaphor of the king comes into his, you know, into to his people with these ministers that do have some power? So says the Rebbe. So the metaphor is not because that they have some kind of choice in the matter. No, in the end, they are only a tool. They're only an axe in the hands of the wood chopper. But for the main thing for the nations of the world is what they get in life. What's in it for me? What do I have? They want to get the biggest bang for their dollar. They want to get the most that they can get, right? The most they can get in life. So therefore, they're going to go to the minister, right? After all, if you're a farmer and the agricultural minister, I stand a good chance here, right? The Jewish people, on the other hand, the main thing for them is to serve the king. Hmm. So it's here is a question of to be served or to serve. That's what we're talking about. What does this mean? The main reason that the nations of the world, right, serve idolatry, and idolatry here does not mean, just things that happened, 3,000 years ago, but today's idolatry. is because to receive from holiness, you need bittul, self-effacement. And the nations of the world don't want to self-efface themselves. They want to get what they want. They want what they want. Right. Putting yourself aside, see, that's the difference between to serve or not to serve. To serve means you're putting yourself aside to serve your master, what he wants. Doesn't matter what you want. It's what he wants. Well, they don't want to do it. God wants. They want to do what they want. Right? And to serve anything outside of God, well, as as we see in the Torah, many instances of this idea of that even the Jewish people at times, they rebel against God because they want what they want. And furthermore, it's in order to receive greater influence from above that comes. Well, you know what? We're going to stop here. We'll continue with that. Continue with that thought. So they don't want to nullify themselves because they want what they want in life. They'll they'll do whatever they have to do. Yeah, I'll go through the motions of if I have to, to gain what I want. So yeah, if I have to say these prayers, I'll say these prayers. It's not about serving. It's about getting. It's about getting what I want. That's not the Jewish way. All right. See you shortly. Thank you, folks.